Well, welcome everyone to our webinar on sexual harassment. My name is Lisa Stockwell and I'm a Senior Human Resources Consultant for Harrison's, a Brisbane-based HR consulting firm established in 2009. This webinar will run for roughly 40 minutes. As I said, we've got lots to cover, so we won't necessarily have time for questions, but feel free to contact me after the event if you do have any feedback or questions. Today's webinar is on sexual harassment. In light of the latest findings from the 2024 Status of Women report card, it's evident that sex discrimination and sexual harassment remain a pervasive issue in Australia, affecting various aspects of women's lives from economic equality to workplace dynamics. As an HR consultancy committed to promoting equality and fairness, we urge business leaders to confront these issues head on. Ensuring your workplace is one in which women are truly treated as equals is not just the right thing to do. The benefits for business cannot be overstated. Women are a highly skilled talent pool. Over 60% of university graduates are women. It increases an organisation's market value. Increasing women's representation by just 10 percentage points or more on the boards of Australian ASX listed companies has led to a 4.9% increase in the company market value, which is actually worth the equivalent of about $78 million for the average company. Further, ASX 500 companies with women directors delivered significantly higher return on equity than those companies without any women on their boards. 6.7% over 3 years and 8.7% over 5. Sex discrimination and sexual harassment do not just affect women. LGBTQI+ employees who are out at work are 50% more likely to innovate than those who are not, and are 28% more likely to provide excellent customer or client service than those who are not. So let's get started. Now, of course, we are human resources professionals, we are not lawyers, and we do not provide legal advice. And of course, we're not providing any specific advice for your particular organisation, as every organisation and every situation is unique. Harrison's, for those of you who might not have used all of our services before, we have 4 key service areas. We have a consulting arm, a human resources team where we actually go and work in a client organisation. We do recruitment, and we have an online service, My HR Experts. If you'd like any more information, please reach out to us. Every time we do a webinar, we have a different charity that we're supporting, and this month we are supporting the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation. 65 Roses Day is the National Day of Awareness for cystic fibrosis. The term originated from a 4-year-old boy who misheard the name of his disease as 65 roses. CF is one of the most common autosomal recessive life-limiting diseases affecting children and adults in Australia. It causes a thick, sticky mucus which affects the lungs and the digestive system. In the 1950s, babies born with CF often died while still in infancy. However, babies born today can expect to live well into adulthood as CF becomes a much more manageable disease due to advances in research and new treatments. At present, there is still no cure for CF. Now that the faulty gene has been identified, though, global research is moving towards finding new ways of repairing or possibly replacing it. On average, 1 in 25 Australians carries the defective CF gene. This means in Australia, about 1 million people are carriers, often without being aware of it. Now, as you know, today's session is on sexual harassment. Sexual harassment and its partners in crime, gendered violence, and family and domestic violence are in the headlines daily at the moment. We are rapidly approaching 2 women being killed every week in Australia due to gender-based violence, up from an average of just 1 a week a couple of years ago. The definition of sexual harassment hasn't changed. We've been actually trotting out the same definition and examples for quite literally decades now. Sexual harassment and gendered violence are all part of the same continuum. The Sex Discrimination Act was passed in 1984, 40 years ago. In spite of this, sexual harassment, sex discrimination, and gendered violence are still an entrenched part of our society and our workplaces. So we'll be looking specifically at sexual harassment in the workplace. We'll be exploring the new obligations for managers and the structural and cultural factors that enable sexual harassment to continue happening before we turn and have a look at a few recent cases and finally how to prevent sexual harassment from occurring in your workplace. Now, please note that we will be discussing some real life events, and some of you might find that confronting or triggering. If that's the case, please, I would encourage you to reach out to your EAP just for a little bit of support. So, what are we talking about when we talk about sexual harassment? Well, sexism and sexual harassment often take place in front of an audience, or they're later described to others. Doing it in front of other people is actually a very powerful move by the perpetrator. Firstly, it signals that the behaviour must be okay. I mean, after all, if it wasn't, why on earth would they do it in front of witnesses? Secondly, it tests the boundaries, not only of the victim, but of that social group. And if there are no consequences, no pushback, no other repercussions, it lets the perpetrator know that they can go further next time, particularly if others aren't around. As I said earlier, the definition of sexual harassment has not changed, and we have been trotting out this definition and these examples for literally decades now. Sexual harassment can take various forms: unwelcome touching, hugging, kissing, staring, or leering, sexually explicit pictures, screensavers, jokes, intrusive questions about a person's private life or their body, unnecessary familiarity, insults or taunts based on your sex, sexually explicit emails or text messages, accessing sexually explicit internet sites, and so on. Sexual harassment is not sexual interaction, flirtation, attraction, or friendship which is invited, mutual, consensual, or reciprocated. Sexual harassment is a legally recognised form of sex discrimination, and sexual harassment and sex discrimination are both unlawful under the Sex Discrimination Act. Sexual harassment is also now unlawful under the Work Health and Safety Act as well. Forty years on, we still have a problem. The Workplace Gender Equality Agency reported that 98.5% of organisations with more than 100 employees have a sexual harassment policy. Yet the ABS reports that in the last 12 months, of the 9.9 million women, adult women, living in Australia, 1.3 million of us experience sexual harassment, compared to just over 400,000 men, which is also not a good figure. 97% of these women were harassed by a male. Men were also just as likely to experience sexual harassment by a male as they were a female. The likelihood of being sexually harassed is significantly higher if you are also born overseas, if you are a person of colour, have a disability, you're under the age of 24, or if you live in a household that experiences financial stress, or if you are not heteronormative. In fact, nearly 50% of migrant and refugee women have experienced at least one form of sexual harassment in the workplace in the last 5 years. And 99%, so just about everyone, non-binary people report being harassed at work. The news headlines in the last month paint a similar story. from high school boys to former US presidents. From the bedroom to the boardroom, sexual harassment and gendered violence is pervasive. But for most women, their experiences of sexual harassment are not worthy of making the front page. Here are just some of my recent experiences while working in the legal industry. These are all things that have either been said directly to me or reported to me in my capacity as HR. I'll just give you a minute just to read through some of them. So why am I sharing with you these examples of microaggressions? Well, because we know that the acceptance of these little things paves the way for the acceptance of bigger things to occur. This model by Gordon Allport was developed after World War II at the request of the US government to try and find a way to explain how the Holocaust occurred. And it is actually still highly relevant today, and it can be applied to any diversity dimension: gender, race, age, and so forth. Sexual harassment goes hand in hand with bullying, intimidation, and discrimination on the ground of gender. Indeed, where women report high levels of one of these behaviours, they report higher levels of the others as well. I want to spend a bit of time on these first two levels because this is where being an active bystander can make an enormous difference. And it's also where the majority of sexual harassment occurs. Anti-locution means speaking against. For example, name calling of certain groups of people, whinging poms as an example. It becomes the norm and it isn't really questioned. Bystander training is essential to stop the anti-locution from developing into avoidance. Stuff like, oh, must be that time of the month, dumb blonde, the girls on reception. Not that there's anything wrong with that. You might recall in the Year 11 Yarra Valley Grammar School boys' little spreadsheet that they had words such as wifey, cutie, or charmingly, unrapeable. Is a grade 11. An analysis of thousands of performance reviews by Harvard Business School has also identified that the choice of words used to describe female performance compared to male performance is startlingly different. And this actually has a direct impact on promotion readiness. The research found that women are systematically less likely to receive specific feedback tied to outcomes, both when they receive clear praise and when the feedback is developmental. In other words, men are offered a clearer picture of what they are doing well and more specific guidance on what is needed to get to the next level. Men were also much more likely to receive clear feedback that was tied to business outcomes. Further, when women received specific developmental feedback, it tended to be overly focused on their communication style. Women received most of the negative feedback about their communication styles. In fact, 76% of references of being too aggressive happened in women's performance reviews. So why does this gendered language matter when we're talking about sexual harassment? Because even at this seemingly innocuous level, it has a direct impact on the women that you work with, the daughters in your home, and your sisters in their workplaces. Our choice of words for male and female genders collectively suggests that women are soft, they're emotional, they need to be protected. And in contrast, men are confident, courageous, reliable, and honourable. Gentleman's agreement, for example. And once we can position ourselves as better than another person or group, then it becomes really easy to condone or to justify other behaviours against that individual or group. Now, this phenomenon is not the exclusive domain of gender. We see it play out across the world with different religions, political ideologies, cultures, and races. Let's now have a look at the legal obligations that we have as managers in this area. The Anti-Discrimination and Human Rights Legislation Amendment Act, known more colloquially as the Respect at Work Act, was passed in late 2022. That was in response to the Respect at Work Sexual Harassment National Inquiry Report of 2020, which made 55 recommendations to better prevent and respond to workplace sexual harassment. The resultant Respect at Work Act amended the Sex Discrimination Act, the Fair Work Act, the Workplace Gender Equality Act, the Australian Human Rights Commission Act, and the Work Health and Safety Acts of various states as well. So there are some key changes that all of this legislation has resulted in. We have a positive duty to eliminate sexual harassment. It's no longer just enough to respond to it. Having a hostile work environment on the ground of sex is unlawful. Complainants or applicants now have 24 months to make a complaint, up from just 6 months. There are now stop sexual harassment orders, which work the same as a stop bullying order. They've actually lowered the threshold for the definition of harassment on the ground of sex, and the Australian Human Rights Commission has greater powers to investigate. They don't actually need to wait for a complaint, they can actually go and investigate off their own bat. So we'll have a look at some of these in a bit more detail. The upshot of the Respect at Work Act is that every organisation now has a legal obligation to do this. What's on your screen? It is no longer just enough to respond to sexual harassment, sex discrimination, or victimisation. You must proactively prevent it. The changes to the Work Health and Safety Act also mean that employers have a positive duty to take reasonable and proportionate action to eliminate, or as far as practicable minimise, psychosocial hazards in the workplace. And sexual harassment is a psychosocial hazard. Now, this includes psychosocial hazards that can come from clients and other third parties. So all of this means that if you are a PCBU, basically if you're a manager, someone who has that level of responsibility, you have a legal responsibility to ensure that psychosocial hazards at work are effectively managed. Having a culture of active bystanders will actually be a key part of managing this. But that can only happen if you have a psychologically safe work environment in the first place. Hostile work environment on the ground of sex is unlawful. So what does this actually mean? Well, a person will be found to have subjected another person to a workplace environment that is hostile on the ground of sex if, well, first of all, the conduct needs to be at the place where they work. They both need to be there at the same time, or the second person is there afterwards. And a reasonable person, having regard to all of the circumstances, would have anticipated the possibility of the conduct resulting in the workplace environment being offensive, intimidating, or humiliating to a person of the sex of that second person. By reason of that person's sex, a characteristic that generally relates to a person of that sex, and in determining whether a person has been subjected to a hostile work environment, you need to look at the seriousness of the conduct, whether the conduct was continuous or repetitive, and the role, the influence, or the authority of the person engaging in the conduct. It's really important to remember that the behaviour does not need to be directed at a particular person for it to be considered offensive, intimidating, and humiliating. It could be as simple as the boss using offensive language, which members of one sex find offensive or humiliating. There is no longer a requirement for the alleged wrongdoer to have engaged in unwelcome conduct of a seriously demeaning nature. All that is required now is that the unwelcome conduct was of a demeaning nature. It's important to note that the harassing conduct does not need to be sexual in nature. It just needs to be sex-based. So, for example, saying that a woman who is arguing a point is getting emotional, or it must be that time of the month, could be considered examples of harassment on the ground of sex. So if we've had the Sex Discrimination Act in place for 40 years, why was the Respect at Work Act introduced? Well, here's a few examples why. Whether deliberate or unconscious, bias makes it harder for women to get hired and promoted and negatively impacts their day-to-day work experiences. Nearly three-quarters of women experience bias at work, and yet fewer than a third of employees actually recognise bias when they see it. 50% of workplace sexual harassment cases last for more than a year. Now, to me, this suggests that there are many and frequent opportunities for co-workers to observe and intervene in inappropriate conduct. In fact, in the last 5 years, over 40% of people witnessed or heard about sexual harassment of another at work, but only a small fraction, just a third of these people, then took action to prevent or reduce the harm. Further, fewer than 1 in 5 victims made a formal complaint about sexual harassment. So you cannot rely on your reporting stats to identify if you have a harassment and discrimination problem or not. Women are actually 3 times more likely to be interrupted than men in meetings, and their ideas are often appropriated by others. When a person's ideas aren't heard, it can be harder for them to be perceived as a key contributor, which in turn can harm their career progression. The reason for this? Well, men are often socialised to display dominance in competitive public settings, and interrupting is a power move. And who could blame them? The researchers found that male executives who speak more often than their peers are deemed more competent, while female executives who speak up are considered less. Frequent interruptions can also be read as a sign that the interrupter believes that their status is higher than the person who is being interrupted. Any organisation, any team will have different people who take on informal roles outside of their actual job description. There are very few job descriptions that include tasks such as load the dishwasher and tidy the kitchen, organise birthday morning teas for my colleagues, be the safe pair of hands to clean up a workplace mess, be the buddy for a new team member, be the shoulder to cry on when things aren't going so well, uh, organise the annual leave roster. Yet we find all of these unspoken expectations, also referred to as office housework or non-promotable work, are essential to the well-being of any team. And they are typically performed by women. And because they're not included in any formal job description, they are not recognised or rewarded. Perversely though, when women choose not to do these tasks, they're actually penalised for it. Whereas if men stay late to help prepare for a meeting or help out with office housework tasks, they receive an average 14% increase in their performance ratings. Now, these findings have been replicated across the private and public sectors and across a wide range of roles, with the analysis showing that the median woman spends more than 200 hours on non-promotable work each year compared to the median man. This equates to about a month of non-rewarded work. And finally, a survey conducted by the Human Rights Campaign Foundation in 2014 found that just over a third of LGBTQI+ respondents feel compelled to lie at work about their personal lives. Now, this comes at an emotional cost, with a fifth reporting that they feel exhausted from spending time and energy hiding their identities. When the same survey asked heteronormative respondents how often conversations about social relationships and dating come up in the workplace, 80% responded that they would occur weekly and often daily. Yet fewer than half of the same respondents said they would feel comfortable hearing their LGBTQI+ co-workers talking about dating. So what are the structural and cultural factors that are making it so hard for us to eliminate sexual harassment? So let's start by having a quick look at the Status of Women in Australia report card. This is produced annually by the federal government. It's a sobering read for a country that prides itself on a fair go and equality for all. So, a couple of key stats to point out. Women work longer hours, but they earn less than men. And this starts immediately after graduation. A quarter of women have experienced sexual violence, and the figure is even higher for sexual harassment. Research shows that gender bias contributes to women being passed over for jobs and promotions. As we looked at the start, almost 3 in 4 women experience bias at work, and those that do are more likely to leave their jobs. Women of colour, non-heteronormative women, women with disabilities face more acute biases. And yet, as we know, only 1 in 3 employees, including managers, actually see these biases or even recognise these biases in the first place. One of the reasons why focusing on the processes and not personal awareness is critical for us as managers is to help reduce this bias and increase diversity. We're blind to our own biases, and so if we can change our process, we don't need to rely on our own perceptions. Leanin.org, in conjunction with McKinsey & Co, has done extensive research on the challenges faced by women at work, and they've identified 6 key gender-based biases. The likability bias. Culturally, we expect men to be assertive and women to be kind and communal. And when either gender goes against their stereotype, we just don't like it. If women are assertive, they're viewed as bossy, not someone you'd like to work for. However, if they're likable, then they're seen as less competent. Performance bias. Statistically, we underestimate women and we overestimate men because women are hired or promoted based on their past achievements and men are hired or promoted based on their future potential. When researchers replace a woman's name with a man's name on a CV, it increases the chance of being hired by 60%. When performance criteria are unclear, evaluators will typically shift the criteria around to best favour men over women. This results in lower performance ratings and missed opportunities for women. Maternal bias. Mothers are seen as less committed than fathers to work, and this perception actually starts from as soon as we're engaged. Conversely, men are then seen as more committed to work. Attribution bias. Now, this is closely linked to performance bias. Because we see women as less competent than men, we are less likely to give women credit for success and more likely to attribute blame to them when things go wrong. Women are often held to higher standards than men as well. Affinity bias. Mentors are typically attracted to proteges that remind them of themselves, and hiring managers tend to spend more time with people who are like them. As white men tend to hold more positions of power, the affinity bias has a strong negative impact on women and on people of colour. And finally, intersectionality. As you all know, bias is not limited to gender. Women can also experience biases due to their race, sexual orientation, disability, or other aspects of their identity, and the effect of this bias is often magnified. Sexual harassment is a social problem that also plays out in our workplace. To prevent sexual harassment in the workplace, we need to understand the key underlying drivers of sexual harassment. While sexual harassment is primarily driven by gender inequality and a power imbalance, the Respect at Work Council, in conjunction with the Australian Human Rights Commission, has broken this down into 4 key drivers. Firstly, condoning sexual harassment against women. When workplaces support or condone sexual harassment against women, levels of sexual harassment are higher. Justifying, trivialising or excusing the behaviour or blaming the victim for its occurrence are all part of this. You need to combat it through active bystander intervention training, your leadership team walking the talk, and ensuring that your policies and procedures don't implicitly condone harassment or discrimination in the workplace. Secondly, men's control of decision making in public and private life. The distribution of power between men and women in private and public spheres, including in the workplace, is an important dimension of gender inequality. For example, if women are seen as having lower status, then they're seen as having lower social value and less worthy of respectful treatment. Setting gender equality targets for leadership roles, ensuring all voices are heard in meetings and forums, and recognising and promoting the achievements of women in the workplace are just some of the ways your organisation can address this driver. Thirdly, a rigid adherence to gender roles and gender stereotypes. A strong belief in these stereotypes is consistently associated with high levels of sexual harassment. Gender stereotypes, such as we only have women on reception, contribute to gender segregation in the workforce and penalise people who dare to act in a different way to the gender that they were born. For example, female leaders are often described as bossy, aggressive, and abrasive for the same behaviours that men are then seen as commanding, competitive, and forthright. Two actions you can take are to plan and support for non-traditional gender-based roles in your department and to recognise workplace habits that are based on gender. For example, which gender usually takes the minutes for a meeting, organises team morning teas, or sorts out the annual leave calendar? Finally, male-peer relations that emphasise aggression and disrespect towards women can really reinforce the stereotypes and aggressive forms of masculinity, which of course are associated with high levels of sexual harassment towards women. This can include things like sexist jokes and commentary. By actively promoting positive relationships at work based on healthy masculinities and respect is essential. This might mean that you need to have education, training, and mentoring on positive workplace cultures. The Respect at Work Council has identified these 7 factors as the most common ones for increasing the risk of sexual harassment occurring in the workplace. Which of these are relevant for your industry or for your workplace? Is there a common culture of a lot of drinking or getting together after work? Is it a highly competitive environment? Is there a significant gender imbalance, either overall or in different teams or at different levels? What's the financial motivation like? Do you have a very strong bonus structure that then ends up pitting people against each other, or they're prepared to shortcut things to get the finance, to get the money? Is there a culture of conformity? Is there a significant power imbalance or a hierarchy? Or do you have people working in isolation? There are some unique organisational structures and cultures in the legal profession that continue to enable harassment to flourish, in spite of the fact that the majority of lawyers are now women and the vast majority of support staff have always been women. So these are the 4 in the legal industry: a power imbalance and hierarchy. Law firms, as you expect, typically have a very hierarchical structure, as does the judiciary. Now, hierarchies can lead to strong leadership, effective mentoring, and the development of career paths. These are all great things, but it can also lead to dominating, intimidating, and harassing bullying behaviour. Even though the vast majority of employees in the legal industry are women, the vast majority of senior players are still men. There's still a lot of talk about workplace flexibility, but it's hard to find many examples of lawyers job sharing, finishing at 5, or heaven forbid any earlier. This lack of workplace flexibility continues to make it hard for primary caregivers, usually women, to hold those senior roles. Conformity. Now, look, this can be a great cultural trait when we're conforming to good behaviours and values. But when we conform to let poor behaviour occur, conformity becomes a problem. Financial motivation. Look, this is a real problem when the financial performance is rewarded, regardless of the poor behaviour. And finally, competition. This is the problem if the competition is so important that people behave inappropriately to get ahead, whether it's cheating or just throwing other team members under the bus. Let's have a look at a few recent cases. Now, often in organisations, we're not sure where the line should be, and so we'll err on the side of, don't do it again and let things go. So let me share with you 3 recent examples of consequences that the courts have deemed appropriate. In Bridge and Globe bottle shops, Mr. Bridge leered at a female customer and asked if she'd like a root with her receipt. Charming individual. Not surprisingly, the customer complained and Mr. Bridge was dismissed. The court held this was a valid reason for dismissal. Similarly, a long-serving male bank manager with an exemplary employment record squeezed the bottom of a younger co-worker at a work-related social event where they had both been drinking. Again, the court held that this was a valid reason for dismissal. The owner of a jewellery store slapped the bottom of his younger female employee on 2 occasions, gave her many unsolicited and often expensive gifts, and said things like, "You are perfect. You have bedroom eyes." And this resulted in the largest payout yet under the Sex Discrimination Act. Now, following a 2022 investigation into sexual harassment in Rio Tinto, which found almost half of its employees and contractors had experienced bullying and sexism in the workplace, including 21 women who had either been raped or sexually assaulted, Shine Lawyers is now investigating whether Rio Tinto and its related subsidiaries failed to take adequate steps to eliminate discrimination and sexual harassment for its employees, and if so, if they should be held liable. So I think this is the first potential class action case that we're going to be seeing in Australia for sexual harassment. Now you'll note I've got 2 other cases down the bottom there, which are bullying and micromanagement cases. And I just really wanted to include them there so you could see the high payout figures. And this is because of the future economic loss to the individuals caused due to the injury from the bullying behaviour, as well as the fines and whatnot, which is a much smaller portion of that. Given that the Psychosocial Hazards Code of Practice is now in force in all states, and sexual harassment is specifically listed as a psychosocial hazard, I think we can expect to see more of these big payouts. Now, these cases are actually still on appeal, but you will appreciate the hundreds of thousands of dollars being spent by these companies to defend themselves, not to mention the reputational damage that they are incurring. There are penalties, not surprisingly, for employers and directors. Under the Fair Work Act, a company or a person can be held vicariously liable for sexual harassment that has occurred. Now, the civil penalties really aren't that much. Yes, it would hurt to pay $16,500 as an individual, but it's the unlimited compensation that's available that can be claimed by the victim that you should be particularly concerned about. There are also penalties, as I've just mentioned, under the work health and safety legislation as well. So how do you prevent sexual harassment in your workplace? Now, to comply with the Respect at Work legislation, you need more than a policy and the occasional bit of training. The Respect at Work Council has developed the Workplace Prevention and Response Framework, which covers 7 integrated areas. Leadership. So does your organisation have a strong internal governance framework to ensure that your leadership team, which includes your board, are being held accountable for preventing and responding to sexual harassment? What are the consequences if they fail to meet their obligations? Your leaders should be assessed against their achievement of DEI targets. Employment practices such as recruitment and promotion must include criteria on fostering an inclusive culture, and you need to have a standalone sexual harassment policy as well. Knowledge. Now, does everyone in your organisation understand what counts as safe, respectful, and inclusive conduct? Do they understand their own role in preventing and responding to workplace sexual harassment? The key to this is regular training and communication on the drivers and contributing factors to sexual harassment, how to respond to it, prevent it, and the consequences for perpetrators, as well as what respectful workplace conduct looks like. Culture. Does your organisation have a diverse workforce with an inclusive culture? And is it making progress on its gender equality? We know that what gets measured gets done. The leadership team needs to set and review those DEI targets and analyse its gender pay gap regularly and take steps to close it. It needs to be consulting with its staff, supporting flexible work practices, and have a policy to address the potential power imbalances or conflicts of interest. Risk assessment and transparency. How does your organisation actively seek to protect workers from sexual harassment? Just like with workplace health and safety, you've got that positive duty of care to prevent harm. And that includes sexual harassment and also family and domestic violence from spilling over into the workplace. By extending your existing work health and safety risk management practices to include psychosocial hazards, including sexual harassment, it's essential. Support. If a team member makes a sexual harassment complaint, are your current policies and practices designed to protect the company or to provide accessible, trauma-informed and support tailored to the individual? It is essential that any worker who reports sexual harassment, including a bystander, can access professional counselling and union support if they want, and that that person receiving the complaint is well trained to respond to it. Reporting. Now, what steps does your organisation take to ensure your workers feel safe enough to report sexual harassment? As we've already talked about, fewer than 1 in 5 actually report it. Do you have a confidential, timely, transparent and independent investigations process? Can complaints be made anonymously? Do you have different reporting channels available? Do you use non-disclosure agreements as a way of protecting the company at the expense of the individual? And finally, measuring. You need to have a robust and transparent data collection and reporting framework to provide information that's needed for further organisational improvements in tackling sexual harassment. This forms the basis of regular reporting to the leadership team, as well as public reporting, such as an annual report that assesses the effectiveness of the organisation's systems and frameworks in addressing sexual harassment. So when should you intervene? Now, what makes sexual harassment a little bit harder to deal with in the workplace compared to other inappropriate behaviours is that perpetrators will typically actively hide their harassing behaviour. And as we have mentioned, very few targets will formally complain about it. Fear of reprisals or an expectation that the response will be inadequate are the main reasons given. Even when legal redress is sought, it is rare for direct eyewitness testimony to be available. Now, many of the recommendations we've just touched on in that last slide require structural changes, policy decisions, or additional training. While discrimination tends to happen at that organisational level, sexual harassment is interpersonal. And what we tend to see in the workplace is the little stuff. Think of that slide that I shared with you at the very start of some of my experiences. I would describe it as laying the foundation that allows for bigger stuff to happen behind closed doors. So if you catch yourself thinking or saying any of the things up on the screen, then your alarm bell should be ringing. Check in with the target. Express your concerns. Even if they say, oh, it was nothing. Make some diary notes about what you've seen or heard. Have a conversation with the perpetrator about why that behaviour is not appropriate. Targets of sexual harassment will often respond passively to the conduct that they are being subjected to. They will often avoid the harasser, trivialise the behaviour, or deny it altogether. And this could be because although targets want the behaviour to end, they also want to avoid reprisals by the harasser. They want to maintain their status and their reputation in the workplace. So if your firm, your organisation is relying exclusively on individual complaints made by targets of harassment, then the elimination of this type of behaviour is unlikely to occur. The research shows that women in general are less accepting than men of sexual behaviour at work. And bystanders are more likely to say that sexual harassment has occurred when the target responds assertively than when they acquiesce or do not communicate that the behaviour is unwelcome. So in spite of the Sex Discrimination Act being in place for 40 years now, it's not surprising that more legislative action has been required. There are lots of things you can do as a manager or as a human resources professional. Conduct regular pay audits. Regularly review and adjust position descriptions and the pay scales to ensure gender parity in salaries and bonuses across the organisation. Positions tend to grow and change over time, and statistically, the roles held by women are less likely to be adjusted for this scope creep compared to the roles held by men. Implementing flexible work policies. Make sure you're fostering an inclusive culture by offering flexible work hours and remote work options to accommodate the diverse needs of all employees, particularly caregivers. Role modelling by senior leaders is essential to signal that these policies are available and acceptable for all. Enhance your parental leave. Provide equitable parental leave for all parents, regardless of who is the primary carer. Encourage shared caregiving responsibilities and supporting women to return to work. Develop anti-harassment programs. Actively promote a zero tolerance policy towards sexual harassment with regular training, including active bystander training for all staff and having a clear, confidential reporting process. Supporting women's advancement. So create mentorship and career development programs specifically aimed at supporting women in leadership and having growth tracks within your company. Encouraging the participation in decision making. So make sure that women are equally represented on committees and in decision making roles to reflect a diverse and balanced perspective. Even simple actions such as selecting a woman to ask the first question when opening the floor to questions makes a significant difference. Review your recruitment practices. So use gender neutral language in your job descriptions. Ensure you have unbiased recruitment processes to attract a more diverse candidate pool. Tools such as Textio will help you to identify words typically associated with one gender, such as collaborative or driven. Promote education on gender equality. Regularly educate all of your employees on gender equality and the benefits of a diverse workforce. Some of these benefits include better decision making, better safety rates, better customer service, innovation, uh, all changing those entrenched stereotypes and biases. I'd also suggest support for menopause and mental health, recognising the physical and mental health needs of women, including support structures for menopausal symptoms and mental health challenges. Right now, I have one friend who has just had a mastectomy yesterday, another one who is going through radiation after a lumpectomy, and the daughter of a friend who has died from metastatic breast cancer. These are real health issues that we are dealing with. Track progress and set goals. As we keep talking about, what gets measured gets done. So regularly measure and publicly report on progress towards your gender equity goals to maintain that accountability and that transparency. And be an active bystander. The behaviour you walk past is the behaviour you accept. You have a responsibility as a manager to have those uncomfortable conversations. And finally, create a psychologically safe work environment. People won't raise concerns if they don't feel safe to do so, or if they don't think action will happen. Harrison's can help you with a lot of these things. We can run employee engagement surveys and the actions needed from that. We can put your team through, your leaders through a leadership development program, assess different leadership styles and provide tailored coaching to that. We can run active bystander training tailored either to your employees or your leadership group. Sexual harassment training, whether that's for the employees, your leaders, or even your board. Whether you need drafting of relevant policies and procedures that align with the new legislation or inclusive recruitment training. We can do any of these things to help your team make sure that they are compliant with this legislation and really performing at their best. So thank you so much for attending today. If you have any questions, comments, feedback, or suggestions for future webinar topics, please reach out to Harrison's. And thank you so much for being part of this session. Thank you.